Hello, it's me, Miss Shea, the Traveling Teach. I'm re-recording my video on the 19th Amendment for two reasons. The first reason is, to put it nicely, the editing was atrocious. In my effort to get it out on the actual 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, it meant that the editing was terrible, and honestly, it also meant that things slipped through the cracks, which leads us to reason number two that this video is being edited. If you saw my first video, then you may have noticed that I accidentally used terminology that is not as respectful for people of color as it could be. Now, it wasn't a racial slur or anything like that. I referred to free blacks instead of free black people. And as always, if you are a teacher, you should also always be a learner. And that is not normally a term that I would use. And I usually use words like Black, Indigenous, people of color, and Black people. So I certainly don't want to perpetuate any sort of language that is not completely encouraging and supportive of people of color, not only of their rights, but also their personhood and their humanity. So that is why this is take two of the 19th Amendment and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which talks about women's suffrage. Hello, it's me, Miss Shea, the Traveling Teach. I'm here to talk to you today about the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment is considered to be the one that allowed women the right to vote. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, but before we get started, let's cover a few things that usually come up when we talk about women's rights. So the first is, what is suffrage? Suffrage is the right to vote. Now, if a woman was fighting for the women's right to vote and for suffrage in the United States, she was called a suffragist. If she was fighting for rights of the women to vote in the United Kingdom, she was called a suffragette. So we will be talking about suffragists today. The second person or thing that we typically think of when we think of the women's movement for the right to vote and the women's suffrage movement is a woman named Susan B. Anthony. So Susan B. Anthony is a little bit of a complicated figure in our history, and we need to talk about her because she did do a lot to move the rights of voting forward for women. Unfortunately, there are also some things that go with that we need to make sure we set right when we discuss history. The first thing to remember about Susan B. Anthony is she is not perfect. No one is perfect. And she made choices and decisions in an effort to try and move the movement forward that she thought would be most beneficial. That being said, what she did was basically ignore women of color in the movement. And she actually went as actively forward with her organization for rights for women to disenfranchise women of color from that movement by going down and befriending middle-class white women of the South who had previously been slave owners. So she actively made steps that encouraged white middle-class women in the South to join her message, but by doing that, she disenfranchised women of color who also were seeking the right to vote, because Black men received the right to vote, but Black women did not. So let's talk for a moment now about how we got to where that was. And by doing that, we need to talk not only about the 19th Amendment, but there are a few other things that we need to discuss. First, there is the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. We also need to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1965. So let's back it up for our history here. Before the 19th Amendment, we had the Civil War. The Civil War ended, and in December of 1965, the 13th Amendment was ratified, which was to free enslaved people. We had, as a nation, had been enslaving people of color for several hundred years. And so this was the culmination of that long battle. The second thing is the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment stated that anyone who was born on the soil in America was a citizen. Well, the women's rights activists tried to use that as a stepping point for them. So they said, okay, well, if the 14th Amendment says that citizens, that anyone born on this land are citizens, well, we're citizens and citizens should have the right to vote. And so then in 1870, the 15th Amendment came out. Now, the 15th Amendment said that men of color would be allowed to vote. And so this was frustrating for all women. And this is when they really began to, in earnest, this is 1870 at this point, this is when things really began to become more urgent for them in terms of securing the right to vote for women. The idea of women's rights actually comes, a lot of it comes from a time in Seneca Falls. There was a Seneca Falls Convention, and that's really considered kind of the big turning point for the movement. And a lot of the ideas that they came from actually came from the indigenous group, the Iroquois Confederation. So the Iroquois Confederation actually treated their women with a significant amount of respect. And the women that saw this were like, we can do this too, we should do this too. And so it's really important that we also remember that Indigenous peoples had a hand in setting the stage for why equal rights for everyone are really, really important. Unfortunately, as I mentioned before, some of the suffragists lost their way. They had originally started out, many of them, as abolitionists, and as abolitionists fighting for the freedom of enslaved people, the idea was, well, if we can set these people free, then we can also then move things forward. They lost their way a bit when they then disenfranchised women of color from the suffrage movement. That's not to say, though, that there were not women of color who were suffragists. There's actually a really long list, and it can be found in the description of this video. I strongly encourage you to go and have a look. But one in particular was a woman named Sojourner Truth. You've probably heard about her. She was a major person in the abolitionist movement, and she actually wrote a work called Ain't I a Woman? And the idea being that men treat women all of these ways. Aren't I a woman too? As a woman of color, aren't I still a woman? And so kind of looking at that and her movement forward and her attempt to not only have votes for women of color, but votes for women for everyone, she, was very much like, if only men of color can vote, well, then they're subjugating women just as much. And Susan B. Anthony felt really strongly that she could handle an oligarchy being a group of wealthy people who are over a smaller group of people and rule them. She has this lengthy quote. To them, this government is not a democracy. It is not a republic. It is an odious aristocracy, a hateful oligarchy of sex, the most hateful aristocracy ever established on the face of the globe. An oligarchy of wealth, where the rich govern the poor, an oligarchy of learning, where the educated govern the ignorant, or even an oligarchy of race, where the Saxon rules the African, might be endured. But this oligarchy of sex, which makes father, brothers, husband, and sons, the oligarchs over the mothers and sisters, the wife and daughters of every household, which ordains all men sovereigns, all women subjects, carries dissension, discord, and rebellion into every home of the nation. Webster, Worcester, and Bouvier all define a citizen to be a person in the United States entitled to vote and hold office. The only question left to be settled now is, are women persons? And I hardly believe any of our opponents will have the hardihood to say they are not. Being persons, then, women are citizens, and no state has the right to make any law or to enforce any old law that shall abridge their privileges or immunities. Hence, every discrimination against women in the constitutions and laws of the several states is today null and void, precisely as is every one against Negroes. So she was saying basically, I can handle an oligarchy of wealth, I can handle an oligarchy of education, and she even said she could handle an oligarchy of race, which is what we have been having and we know is unacceptable. But what she could not tolerate was an oligarchy of men over women. And so this is primarily what drove Susan B. Anthony in her work. She actually started a women's movement organization with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. That was called the National Women's Suffrage Association. There was an additional group out there called the American Women's Suffrage Association, started by Lucy Stone and Julie Ward Howe. And those two groups were both fighting for rights for women. However, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's group wanted all rights for women, not just the right to vote, whereas the American Women's Suffrage Association under Lucy Stone and Julie Ward Howe really were looking for the right to vote, because they felt that once the right to vote happened, then all of these other rights would be able to come into play. And so Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton wanted all rights for women. And the reason for this is because at this time, men controlled everything. They controlled the property, they controlled the children. So one example is if you were married to a man who was abusive to you and you wanted to leave him, he might say that you could leave, but he would be like, you can never see your children again, because he had all the rights over the children at that time. And so these were the kind of rights that Susan B. Anthony was fighting for, in addition to the right to vote. And this is also what women of color were fighting for: their rights as women, their rights as humans, their rights as people and citizens of the United States, in order to have their voice heard as well. So that is a little bit about the 19th Amendment. So the 19th Amendment finally comes around in 1920. And the thing to remember about this is, many people say the 19th Amendment is what gave women the right to vote. So we need to make sure that we're saying it correctly. What the 19th Amendment did was that it said you could no longer be discriminated against your sex, your gender. Just because you were a woman, you could no longer be discriminated against for the right to vote. However, there were other ways for people to be discriminated against, and we are already seeing that after the Civil War. So even though the 15th Amendment gave men of color the right to vote, a group of things came into play called the Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws were a series of laws all across the country that found ways to keep people of color from experiencing their full rights as humanity and as citizens of the United States. Examples of that include having a poll tax you had to pay to be able to vote, having literacy tests and things like that, that were intentionally designed not only to reduce the opportunities for people of color, but also the opportunities for people of lower economic standing. So this also affected poor white people as well, but it disproportionately affected and disenfranchised men of color and women of color from the vote, and from expressing their views as a citizen of the United States. So the 19th Amendment comes in, and it really is primarily seen as, when we look through the lens of history, it is primarily seen as an opportunity for white women to be able to vote. White women pushed the vote, they finally get the vote, and so that's why there can be some complicated feelings around the 19th Amendment. Women of color did not actually gain full rights to vote until 1965, when the Voter Rights Act came into place and said, you cannot actively discriminate against people of color. It's only been in the last 45 years or so that women of color have finally been able to have their full expression of their humanity and their citizenship of the United States. So we just need to keep these things in mind when we learn about these historical events. Was the 19th Amendment important? Yes, it moved history forward one tiny step. But we also need to remember that there were still things about it that were imperfect and that still required fixing and correcting to make sure that everyone can receive and achieve their fullness of citizenship here in the United States. So I would encourage you, this is really just meant to be a small snippet of the history of the women's suffrage movement. I really would encourage you to go back and to do more, learn more about the women of color that were suffragists, learn more about the suffragist movement, the things that it did right and the things that it did not do right, and figure out how you can continue to move forward the rights of others in your life and in your community in one small way every single day. When you see something that is unfair or unjust, stand up, speak, make your voice known, make your voice heard, and then you can be a part of the ongoing legacy of continuing to make America everything that it was meant to be, which was a place for everyone. Thank you so much for watching.